carry on with Luis Gouveia Jr.'s presentation.
Thank you. Okay, the intention is over there. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today, presenting this paper. I would like to start explaining why I decided to carry out this research. Basically, reading the press from Brazil, China, and the European Union, I realized that in all of them, there was a quite similar discourse that each one of these actors, they were defending the end of the war, of the Ukraine war. However, when we look at how one of these actors are talking about the others, we realize that they mutually accuse each other of being propelling the war. So if we look in the press in Brazil, for instance, they say that the European Union is fueling the conflict while it is sending weapons to Ukraine. We look how China, in this case official press, the Global Times, how they portray China. They said that NATO expansion caused the war. The same happened in the European Union when the Brazilian president came to Portugal. For example, some political parties argued that he is supporting Russia and also fueling the conflict, and the same with China. And then we have this picture in which each one of these actors, they portray themselves as peace defenders, as defending the end of the Ukraine war, but in the meantime, they accuse the other actors as propelling the conflict. So we have this kind of paradox. And as the literature shows, in moments of war, the official propaganda dismisses the capacity of hearing the other or the enemy, in this case, not necessarily an enemy, but the other side of the conflict. So what I try to understand in this piece is what are these leaders really talking about the Ukraine war? How they comprehend the idea of peace, of conflict resolution, what caused this war. And then, in the article, I also included a theoretical discussion about these concepts of peace, conflict resolution, and so on. But here, because of the time, I decided to cut this part. But going to the methodology, then I proceeded with a textual analysis. Of course, I could have, I did a content analysis, I could have done a discourse analysis, for instance, but specifically in this case, as I want to understand what are these leaders talking, then the literature indicates that content analysis works better, then this is why I proceeded in this way. However, as we all know in international relations, a mere word counting of content analysis is not enough to understand such complex questions as we try to understand. And then I followed what Pashak and Lu proposed for international relations content analysis. It is this kind of fully integrated content analysis in which we include both a quantitative part, but also a qualitative part using both a computer and a manual design. Regarding my data, I collected all the statements from official portals of these three international actors. In the case of the European Union, I gathered all the statements made by Ursula von der Leyen, presented by the European Commission portal. In the case of Brazil, the Brazilian president. In the case of China, the data from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. My data set comprises almost 170,000 words, but represented around 450 pages. And all this data came from the period between February 2022 and June 2023. And I used this software called Sketch Engine. It's a software commonly used in social science to analyze this data. Starting with my quantitative content analysis and the results that I found. In this table, I started with a very simple analysis of the recurrence of some specific words. And what we can find there, especially looking at the mentions per 1,000 words, is that indeed von der Leyen almost never talked about peace. The word peace almost never appeared in her discourses. Meanwhile, she also is the one talking more about war. What indicates that Lula da Silva, when he says, and I will talk a bit more later about that, when he says that some leaders are not talking about peace, indeed, when we look to the data on von der Leyen, it happened. And then after this initial analysis, I proceeded with what is called anagrams, that basically are combinations of 2 until 4 words. And the first thing that I try to identify is how these 3 leaders name the conflict. And in the case of Brazil, the Brazilian president, he used a panoply of different terms, since war in Ukraine, Ukraine war, conflicts in Ukraine, war between Russia and Ukraine. In the case of China, they used 2 terms, Ukraine crisis, Ukraine issue. I didn't find any reference to Ukraine war. The word war doesn't appear there. But the most interesting result here is regarding the European Union, because Ursula von der Leyen, instead of calling the Ukraine war or something like that, in her statements, she referred to it as the Russian war or Putin's war. So we have here a clear expression that Russia is totally accountable for the war. The term, just to compare the term war in Ukraine in von der Leyen's speeches, it appeared 5 times. In 3 of them, it was Russia war in Ukraine. So she's always referring to Russia as responsible for the war. I also identify other interesting anagrams, just to mention a few. In the case of Brazil, among the 5 most mentioned by the Brazilian president, I found the United Nations and the Security Council, what evidenced how, for the Brazilian president, the Security Council plays a pivotal role in his foreign policy. In the case of the European Union, among the 5 most mentioned anagrams, we could find Russian fossil fuels, what also shows that this idea of energy appeared very recurrently in her speeches. Then, starting with the qualitative content analysis, and as I mentioned, it is this dual part. In the case of Brazil, I didn't find a clear explanation for the beginning of the war. Lula da Silva, he didn't present a concise and reason for that. Sometimes he pointed out to NATO, and he says that NATO expansion caused Russia to attack Ukraine. Sometimes he says that that it is Russia's fault. So in the second point that I found regarding Brazil, and it's quite interesting because Lula da Silva clearly he makes a distinction between ending the war and constructing peace. In one passage, he even mentioned that right now, what is important is ending this war. After that, Russia and Ukraine should dialogue, should talk to start constructing a lasting peace. So it is interesting if we think in terms of theory, that it brings Lula da Silva very close to some peace studies theories like Johann Galton, when he says about the idea of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. And it's very clear in Lula da Silva speeches. Concerning how to end this war, he also, in a very recurrent term, he proposes the creation of a G20 to discuss the end of the war, and specifically, he defends peace talks and negotiation. In the case of China, China is way clearer regarding the beginning of the war, and they account there to Russia's security concern, especially in February and March 2022. There are some calls between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping affirmed that he comprehended Russia's security concerns, and he refused what he called a Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation. These are 2 terms also very recurrent in the data on China. And he proposes this global security initiative. That basically he had in the paper a lot of proposals. Two of them are quite interesting. One is regarding the territorial integrity of all countries. That in the first instance could be something support to Ukraine. However, he also included that all country security concerns should be listened when we think in terms of international security, international peace. What in the text I could also identify that these in European terms legitimate Putin's concern. Finally, he also defends peace talks and negotiation. This is very recurrent in almost all the articles published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. At the end, there is a note or a comment saying that China and Xi Jinping stressed that they defend the return of peace talks and negotiation. Regarding von der Leyen, she is the clearest among the three regarding what she thinks about this war. The war for her arose because of Putin's imperialistic behavior. It is interesting because this idea she also condemns what she considers power politics and an old-fashioned way of acting in the international system. And she defends economic interdependence, international organizations, and democracy as tools to create peace. What, in terms of international relations theory, bring her very close to the liberal theory, not only the neoliberal, but also the democratic peace theory. And in this case, she also perceives that the war in Ukraine is a war between democracy and autocracy. It's also present, the idea is present in many of her speeches. And finally, she affirms that peace must be established with Ukrainian victory. And so we can see here the difference between her points and the other two. Concluding my presentation, I try to find some points of convergence among the three, and also points that they disagree in this research, answering the original question, or what are they talking about peace and conflict resolution in this case. And in fact, all of them agree that the war must end. This is clear in all three data. And also they reject what they consider an outdated power politics. In the case of the European Union, as I mentioned, an imperialistic behavior and war is something outdated. In the case of China, they rejected, and again using the Chinese terms, a Cold War mentality and bloc confrontation that they accounts to a past Cold War era, and they rejected that. In the case of Brazil, this criticism is more regarding the Security Council. Lula da Silva indeed is carrying out a foreign policy that he aims to include Brazil in as a permanent member. And so he affirms that the war also, if the Security Council was totally functional right now, the war could be prevented. So all of them, they reject some characteristics of what they consider, again, an old-fashioned international system. However, it is clear that they disagree concerning the beginning and especially how to end the war. In the case of von der Leyen, for me, it was a surprise because I did not find any mention by her of the word negotiation. And in her case, the data comprises almost 40,000 words. And in 40,000 words, she didn't use the word negotiation at all. And in the meantime, as I mentioned, Brazil and China, these are a very recurrent word in the data. And finally, the three also have different perspectives about what is peace and how to solve the conflict. Lula da Silva closer to some peace studies theorists, von der Leyen closer to some neoliberal theory of international relations, In the case of China, the Global Security Initiative, it's a bit more difficult to identify to a certain theory, as you know. And that's it. Thank you very much.